Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for waiting and welcome to our webinar series. This is a New Jersey Comprehensive School-Based Mental Health webinar series, and this is session 4, Establishing Tiered Supports, tiers number 2 and 3. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. On your screen, you will also see a schedule of our upcoming sessions. Our next one is scheduled for February 23rd. You may register on the flyer that's being circulated, and it has our direct registration links. Next slide, please. Also, individual coaching sessions are being offered to provide more targeted support to New Jersey district level teams. During this 1-hour session, you will meet and develop a plan with our team in the school mental health framework and provide an action plan. And we provide you an action plan to guide your steps. These sessions will be available to all schools and districts on a first come, first served basis and by reservation only. We have an opening this week on January 27th from 2 p.m. to 3 p.m. And I will share the registration link in the chat box towards the end of this presentation. Next slide, please. So the MHTC is funded by SAMSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, to enhance the capacity of the behavioral health and other related workforces to deliver evidence-based and empirically supported practices to individuals with mental illnesses. We ask that you please visit the MHTC Network website for additional information at mhtcnetwork.org. Next slide, please. On your screen, you see a map of all of our MHTC regions. We are Region 2, and we serve New York, New Jersey, Puerto Rico, and the United States Virgin Islands. Next slide. We have also received supplemental funding to provide training and technical assistance to teachers and school staff regarding student mental health, with a focus on the importance of mental health supports in school, building capacity to recognize and identify mental health concerns in students. We also focus on best models of school-based mental health services and linking as needed to community-based services. Next slide. On your screen, you also see our areas of focus within our training and technical assistance programs. Next slide. And if you're interested in staying up to date with the events and products that our center is offering, we ask that you please sign up to receive our email communications, and you can do so by signing up at the bit.ly link that will be provided in the chat box. Following the webinar, you'll be asked to complete a brief survey. We value this feedback and use it to improve our activities and inform future activities. The surveys are also important because our continued funding is linked to the completion of these surveys, so we thank you in advance. Next slide. We also want to let you know that this webinar is being recorded and will be posted to our website along with the PowerPoint slides in the next few days. This presentation was prepared for the Northeast and Caribbean Mental Health Technology Transfer Center under a cooperative agreement from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, or SAMSA. All material appearing in this presentation, except that taken directly from copyrighted sources, is in the public domain and may be reproduced or copied without permission from SAMSA or the authors. Citation of the source is appreciated. Do not reproduce or distribute this presentation for a fee without specific written authorization from the Northeast and Caribbean Mental Health Technology Transfer Center. At the time of this presentation, Dr. Miriam Delphin-Rittman served as acting Assistant Secretary for the Mental Health and Substance Use at SAMSA. The opinions expressed herein are the views of the speakers and do not reflect the official position of the Department of Health and Human Services, or SAMSA. No official support or endorsement of DHHS or SAMSA for the opinions described in this presentation is intended or should be inferred. We encourage you to interact with our presenters during the webinar by using our chat feature. Please post any comments or questions you have in the chat, and I will collect your questions as we go and ask them of the presenter during the Q&A time toward the end of the presentation. During the webinar, our presenter may pose questions to you, so please use the chat feature to answer these questions. Now let's begin our webinar. We have with us Dr. Sharon Lorman, Ms. Amy Panich, and Ms. Teresa Fickelstein. Dr. Sharon Lorman is an assistant professor of pediatrics at the Boggs Center at Robert Wood Johnson Medical School. She completed a PhD in special education from Lehigh University and is actively involved in promoting a tiered intervention framework for conduct, behavior, and social and emotional wellness through scholarly and service activities. Since 2004, she has directed the New Jersey Positive Behavior Support in Schools Initiative, a partnership with the New Jersey Department of Education Office of Special Education. Since 2001, she has served as a member of the editorial board for the Journal of Positive Behavior Interventions, and she is the coordinator for the New Jersey Network for the Association for Positive Behavioral Support, and a member of the Northeast PBIS Regional Network Advisory Group. She is a member of the New Jersey Department of Education's Mental Health Work Group and the Special Education Stakeholder Group. Dr. Lerman is a recipient of the Dr. Irwin A. Hyman Service to Children Award. We also have Ms. Amy Panich. Ms. Panich received a bachelor's degree from the University of Pennsylvania, and after spending 3 years working in the corporate world in New York City, made the decision to switch careers to follow her heart. She earned a Master's of Arts in Teaching at Montclair State in 2005 and immediately obtained her first teaching position at Franklin School in Newark, where she taught 3rd and 4th grade. While teaching at Franklin, she recognized her passion for urban education. In 2010, she was recognized for her leadership abilities and was offered the opportunity to serve in the position of teacher coach in the area of mathematics. In 2016, she earned her 2nd master's degree from Montclair State University in educational leadership and was promoted to vice principal at Franklin School. In 2019, Ms. Panich was appointed to be principal of Franklin School. While in the role of vice principal, Ms. Panich wrote and received grant funding from the Newark Trust to begin building sustainable SEL practices to make Franklin an inclusive environment for all. Franklin has been Ms. Panich's 2nd home for the last 17 years. And also with us, we have Ms. Teresa Fickelstein. Ms. Fickelstein began her teaching career 19 years ago in the Newark Public Schools as a kindergarten teacher. From there, she became a building level literacy coach and spent 3 years in the district literacy department before joining Franklin School as vice principal for the past 3 years. Ms. Fickelstein has a bachelor's degree in psychology and elementary education. In addition to that, she has a master's degree in reading and educational administration and is certified reading specialist and upholds national board certification in early and middle childhood literacy. Upon joining the administrative team at Franklin School, she became the SEL lead, where she is able to grow and support the school-wide PBIS and SEL practices building-wide. So now I want to welcome everyone again, and I will turn it over to our presenters.
Hello and welcome. I'm Sharon Lorman. I'm so happy to be here with you today. I'd like to thank MHTC, sorry about that, for having us and giving me the opportunity to share with you what we're doing with Tier 2 and Tier 3 systems and planning with our partner schools. And I'd also like to thank the many schools that we've worked with over the years who have really helped us to learn a lot of lessons about implementation. And I'll be sharing with you all of these different lessons, and in particular, a special thanks to Halstead Middle School and Burlington Township Middle School, whose examples I'm going to be sharing with you today. So thank you for joining me and for having me a part of this panel. You can go ahead and advance, Christy. And you can advance the animation for the slide. So the mission of NJPDSIS is to build capacity among New Jersey school personnel to implement a multi-tiered system of support that results in equitable access to behavior, conduct, and social emotional wellness interventions, And we primarily use the PBIS, Positive Behavior Interventions and Supports approach to capacity building with our school partners. Go ahead and move forward. In the next few minutes, I'll highlight planning considerations and reflections that contribute to an effective, sustainable, and equitable advanced tier planning process. And it's important to keep in mind that this presentation is not going to cover everything you need to know, but rather it's going to give you some considerations, show you some examples, and give you some things to think about and reflect on within your planning process. You can go ahead and advance. So a big takeaway from the tiered framework is to have an articulated plan that uses data decision rules and includes a continuum of intervention options. And the tiered framework prompts us to anticipate student needs, which really enables us to be more proactive and more responsive. And a strong universal tier is essential to advanced tier planning because it provides a foundation for interventions and essentially creates a culture of prevention. About 80% of students will have their needs met at this tier when core practices are in place. And when the universal tier isn't functioning to its potential, we see a greater scale of need at the secondary and tertiary tier levels. You can go ahead and advance. About 15% of students will benefit from targeted and selective interventions at the secondary tier, and you can advance. And about 5% or less of students will benefit from intensive tertiary interventions. And one final animation. In this presentation, I'll refer to advanced tier interventions. I'll use that phrase, which speak to the continuum of intervention planning for both secondary and tertiary planning. You can go ahead and you can go to the next slide. So getting started really begins with having the right decision makers at the table, and the team's essential to achieving your outcomes. So your decision-making will be most informed when you have personnel with multidisciplinary expertise, and that's going to include academic, behavior, social emotional, mental health, physical health, and wellness. And we all work as partners. You can advance. And the design of advanced tier interventions really involves personnel and budget decisions, along with aligning with district policy. So it's important to have a decision maker at the table, like an administrator, who's present in the conversation and can help decisions keep moving forward and ensure that decisions are in line with your resource availability as well as your policy that your district has in place. And finally, your team needs to be socially valid, meaning that members effectively reflect the needs of all voices and that you're amplifying underrepresented voices in your process so that no one is missed. And social validity includes representing the span of grades and developmental needs of your students, as well as representing the racial, ethnic, and linguistic diversity of your students. And it also means having student, staff, and parent stakeholder voice reflected within your decision-making process to ensure that decisions are equitable and culturally responsive. You can move to the next slide. So taking stock of what you're already doing is really important to arriving at a doable and sustainable plan. Our teams begin by assessing what's already in place and considering how to align existing student outcome measures and interventions within their advanced tier system. And you could pull up the next. So there are a lot of different factors that they look at within their self-assessment process, including district policy, the availability of unique scheduling opportunities, internal personnel who have the capacity to implement different facets of your tiered system at the secondary and tertiary levels, along with your external partners who can provide and meet specialized needs. You'll also look at what existing measures that you have and data collection systems that can be built into your advanced tier process and any interventions that are in place in achieving at least a 70% response rate. And at the end of my presentation, I have a series of reflections that I won't go through today, but that you can look at a later time that prompt you some things to ask and think about when you're reflecting on what's already in place. You can go ahead and advance. So whether you have a tier 2 system in place or you're just getting started, there are some really helpful implementation Fidelity tools that sort of structure your thinking about systems level implementation. And that's really what I'm emphasizing today, is thinking about different facets of your system. So two that we've used in our planning process with schools that have been really helpful are the benchmarks for advanced tiers and the tiered Fidelity inventory, particularly at the tier 2 and tier 3 level. So I'm not able to go sort of in depth into these tools, but the link above, the pbisapps.org, you can access these tools because they're available for public use, as well as information about them. And they're a really great place to start as part of your comprehensive self-assessment, to take a look at what you have in place and identify planning needs. You can go ahead. So I'd like to take a couple minutes to talk about installing, and we're going to go past that, Christy. Thanks. So I'm going to take a couple of minutes to go past installing a system of screening. And we're going to start with defining or giving an idea of what a universal screening is. So it's a process of applying established criteria and decision-making rules. So you have operationalized measures and operationalized rules that help you to predict the level of intervention intensity that a student needs. So having a screening system is really essential, and this includes using multiple measures that are operationally defined. You can go ahead. So research suggests that a system of universal screening using validated measures is a reliable and valid method of predicting future occurrences. And this is really the benefit of a screening process, that students don't struggle before they get the help that they need. The screening really helps us to find students who need additional interventions beyond the universal so that we can meet their specific and unique needs. Numerous instruments have been validated across age, settings, and populations. And some of these tools are free and public access, while others are fee-based and available through vendors. And you have to weigh sort of the benefits and considerations of using a free access tool versus a vendor-based tool. And another consideration is that some tools cast the net really wide. So they screen for an array of concerns, while others have a very specific focus, such as focusing in on depression or anxiety. You can go ahead. So in the absence of a formalized universal screening instrument, you can use office referrals, and they can be helpful to predict externalizing concerns. But for internalizing concerns, targeted universal screening instruments are likely better than office referrals. And really what we're finding is that we have a lot to learn about how to make universal screening work within schools. The research on the instruments themselves gives us a lot of information about how the instruments are validated and how we can use them. What we have to figure out now is, how do we make that system work within the public school context? You can go ahead. So when planning complex systems, I find flowcharts a really helpful way to think through the various steps and phases of the process. It really prompts me to ask questions like, what comes next? What happens when? How do we kind of bridge these steps together? And our school partners will typically develop a flowchart or an articulated table that illustrates the scope and sequence of their screening and intervention process. Burlington Township Middle School, for example, has a couple of different flowcharts that walk their planning team through different decisions based on the data that they're looking at. And it's a really helpful tool on an ongoing basis to guide your decision-making process. So I'm going to use a flowchart to illustrate a macro picture of what a screening process generally looks like, and it'll give me a chance to highlight some important points about screening. So the first is, effective screening really benefits from multiple measures that are operationalized into criteria, and they'll include critical measures such as office conduct referrals, HIB occurrences, suspensions, grades, attendance, and so forth, along with universal screening instruments, which are typically done 2 or 3 times a year. So it's this combination of measures that really help us to identify which students are in need of additional intervention. So these measures yield students that we now have to decide if we're moving forward with intervention. And we do this through a few different methods. First, we'll do a data accuracy check where we review the data and make sure that the information is correct and valid. So for example, if you're using office referrals as critical measures, you want to make sure that those referrals occurred for a credible reason. And you also want to conduct a proportion and equity analysis of your data. So a proportion analysis has you look at the data and ask the question if your screening results are aligned with those expected proportions that we would see within a tiered framework. An equity analysis has us ensure that no student groups are under or overrepresented in our data. And it's a really important part of our sort of confirming the data and the need. You also may obtain stakeholder input for additional information, along with triangulating with other measures. So there's several different questions that we're asking here to ensure that students are effectively being identified and then receiving the intervention that they need. So based on all of this information, we then determine an intervention pathway and intensity. And when you set up your system, your pathways will reflect the specific screening categories that your process yields. For today's purpose in this section, I wanted to illustrate that continuum of intervention planning that occurs at different levels of intensity. So your screening data may suggest that a universal intervention is needed. So for example, if 40% of your students met screening criteria, your proportion really exceeds what's expected. And so you would start to consider and reflect on what kind of a universal prevention plan could help to address that need school-wide. At the secondary level, our teams tend to define criteria for entry and enhanced level of intervention. And this allows them to just differentiate slightly the level of intensity that a particular student may need through the intervention. And then they plan for tertiary tier interventions. So this flow chart is really just illustrated or intended to illustrate sort of the macro process or the big ideas that are occurring within the screening process. You would really need to think about the nuance of decision-making within your own school's advanced tier intervention and how this would work and build out some of these features with a little more depth and decision-making guidance. You can go ahead. There are some important cautions to installing a screening system. So we've learned these through the research as well as through Kathy Lane's work, which you can learn more about at the ci3t.org website. She has tons of really helpful information about screening. She describes screening tools, gives you some things to think about, considerations for implementation. She has lots of implementation tools there too. So first, screening must result in intervention. You really want to have your intervention delivery plan in place before you start your screening process, because you don't want to screen, end up with a list of kids that need an intervention and then not have an intervention to offer. So plan your interventions first and then launch your screening process. Second, if you decide to use a universal screening tool, select one that is evidence-based and socially valid to your need. There are a lot of tools to choose from, and I'd encourage you to really investigate the different options before making a selection. There are a lot of considerations in picking a universal screening tool. You can go, there we go. You also want to stay current on the instrument's scoring procedures. You know, research yields changes in how the data are interpreted. So at least on an annual basis, you want to check to make sure that nothing's changed with your instrument, because that can really impact how you've operationalized your screening decisions. You, of course, want to follow district policy and procedures to make sure that your decision-making is aligned with your district's requirement, and have a process for conducting an accuracy and fidelity check. That's really important. You want to make sure that your process is functioning as it should, as it's been designed, and that the data you're yielding and the decisions you're yielding are really accurate and reflective of need. So our teams find it really helpful to document their decisions. And one way they do this is by creating a screening matrix. And this is an example from Halstead Middle School. So the levels of intervention are along the top and the measures are along the side. Christy, you can advance there's 3 animations. Halstead team used the Strengths and Difficulties questionnaire as their universal screening instrument, along with attendance, grades, critical incidents as additional measures. And so in the body of the matrix, you'll see what they've done is they've operationalized as objectively as possible how they're going to use these measures within their screening process. And so having a way to really operationalize, for example, how you're using attendance or how you're using grades to figure out what level of intensity is needed can be a really powerful tool within your decision-making process. And you can add the final animation. And I'm sharing this as a sample only. It's really important to define measures specific to your school's need. You don't want to necessarily just take what another school did because it may or may not be reflective of your school's unique circumstances. You can go ahead. Some teams also define a list of additional factors that can be really helpful within the screening process. And this is an example from Burlington Township Middle School. When any of these are present, the related information and data are used in combination with their screening measures to arrive at a decision. So you can go ahead. And I'm going to shift now to talking about some considerations for selecting interventions. Now we have this robust screening system in place. Let's consider some different interventions and some important factors in our decision making. So there's several evidence-based interventions that are commonly used at the tier 2 and tier 3 level. And the forthcoming guide from the New Jersey Department of Ed, the mental health guide, is going to provide some examples of these different interventions I've listed. We don't really have time today to dive into them, but I wanted to share 3 important thoughts that kind of go across all 3 of them. And the first is that the research across all these different interventions really agrees that you need to use the interventions for the specific purpose in which they've been designed and evaluated. So for each category generated by your screening measures, and your screening measures will yield different sort of need categories, you'll plan an intervention pathway specific to the content of that need, and you'll be selecting interventions such as the ones that are listed here to address that need. So for example, perhaps your screening measure yields self-regulation as a need category, then we would select an intervention that's specific to developing self-regulation. The second consideration is that research is really fluid and emerging, and new information is coming out all the time. And so we really want to think about how best to implement these interventions along with what kind of outcomes they can achieve, and continually check back with the research to see what's new, what have we learned, how is this expanding or shaping the way we think about how we can use a particular intervention. The sites that I've provided here are really just examples that represent a much larger body of work that supports and describes the purpose of these interventions and how they best can be used. And finally, an evidence-based intervention will only be effective if it's implemented as designed. So it's important to have a system of fidelity monitoring to get the most out of the interventions. And when your data doesn't meet progress rules, one of the first things we can take a look at is implementation fidelity. A lot of times an intervention isn't working because we haven't necessarily implemented it to the standard that we need to. You can go ahead. So as a complement to the screening flowchart, I'd also like to share an example of thinking through the intervention process, and you can go ahead with the animation. Many teams begin by including stakeholder input for specific decisions. So for example, when implementing a check-in system, many of our school teams will meet with the student before the intervention starts, and they'll explain how the check-in system works. They'll get input from the student on shaping particular features around preferences and needs. We'll also establish an intervention goal and define a progress monitoring metric. And these are great places for us to get stakeholder input to sort of shape those decisions. The next thing we think about is really our system of communication and capacity building. So many of our teams will prepare templates that they'll use so that they can communicate regularly with teachers and with parents, such as having a description of the intervention. And they'll also think about what capacity building needs are needed to implement to Fidelity, such as reviewing with a teacher how to use an end-of-class rubric, for example. Once the student begins the intervention, then we start bi-weekly progress monitoring. We're using data rules to help us determine if the student is making progress as expected. So when the data tell us that we're meeting our decision rules and we're making progress, we continue to monitor. And when the student meets their goal, we plan for an exit, which is usually a fading out of the intervention. When our data suggests that we're not meeting our progress rules, then we ask some questions. We want to know why that's happening. So we might gather some additional information about what's going on. And we're also going to check implementation fidelity to make sure that we're implementing as we had intended. Based on that, we may select 2 or 3 enhancements to boost the intensity of the intervention, and then we continue to monitor for progress. And hopefully our enhancements have done the trick and now our data is meeting progress criteria. But if not, then we would continue to ask questions and adjust our interventions so that we can find that good balance of intensity. You can go ahead to the next slide. So in the final example I'd like to show you is many of our school teams document their intervention decisions using a matrix like this. And this is really helpful way to map out across your different screening need categories what interventions you're using. And it allows you to see, are there any gaps in our plan? Are there any overlaps or duplicate interventions? And just prompts you to be thoughtful about your big picture of how everything's going to come together. So you'll see at the top are examples of different possible screening needs, and along the side are different levels of intensity. And then within the body of the matrix are the different examples of interventions that'll be used. And you'll notice the little plus marks, they're there to remind us that we're not necessarily just stopping an intervention because it's not working, but instead we may be layering in additional strategies or interventions or approaches to increase the intensity of what we're providing students. And of course, this is just a sample. It's always important to select interventions based specifically on your needs. All right, we'll go ahead, Christy, and I should be nearing the end of my time. As I mentioned earlier, I had a number of reflections that I had included, and I don't think I have time to go through them today. I think I'm nearing the end of my 25 minutes. But I left them here for you because I thought it would be helpful to have some sort of self-check or some reflections that you can use within your own self-assessment process to determine where your strengths are in your implementation of what you're doing now and places where you might grow or do some additional planning. These, the ones here, one is, does the effort reflect your needs? So measures and interventions really align with the categories generated by your screening process. The second asks, is the effort resulting in outcomes? And I find that 70% criteria really helpful as a benchmark. If I don't have 70% success outcomes, then I want to look more closely at that intervention and figure out if it's really the best choice for us to use. You can go ahead, Christy, and also let me know if I'm out of time, and then we can transition. I'm sorry?
About 2 more minutes.
2 more minutes. Oh, great. So I also asked, is the effort evidence-based? So I want to make sure that research supports implementation, but also your local data. What does your local data tell you about how this intervention is working with your students? You can go ahead. You can go to the next one. Is the effort equitable, socially valid, and culturally competent? And this is a really important question. We have a series of reflections that when we're working with our teams, we really reflect on the extent to which decisions are equitable. And we want to make sure that decisions result in representation proportional to enrollment. We want to make sure that decisions reflect the unique needs of stakeholders, that we have a way to amplify voices, particularly underrepresented voices in our decision-making process. And so this is a place where it's really important to pause and be reflective about your decisions. And a great question to ask is, if we put this particular decision in place, who's going to benefit and who's going to be missed or who's at risk of not benefiting? We find that a helpful starting point for the conversation. You can go to the next one. Is the effort scalable? We have a lot of great interventions out there, but you may not be able to bring them to the scale to address the needs of 15% of your students at tier 2 or 5% of your students at that intensive tier 3 level. So you really have to think about, are we able to sustain this? Are we able to maintain the resources that are needed to keep this decision in place long term? So scalable and sustainable are 2 critical questions. And you can go to the last one. So are your decisions aligned with relevant requirements like policy? And I've mentioned that a couple times. Making sure that you're checking back with your district policy is always really important. And then what personnel are needed to implement the effort? Some screening instruments require particular qualifications or licenses, as do some interventions that you might decide to implement. Most interventions, staff are going to need some professional development on how to implement and how to maintain implementation over time. But you also need to think about your community partners and community providers and how you're working with them as an important source of being able to address specialized needs, for example. So the last thing that I included for you are just some resources that are available. I did neglect to include the pbis.org site, and they just released recently some fantastic resources on universal screening. So just jot that one down because I did forget to put it on the list. It's pbis.org. And you can go back, Christy, to that poll question. And one thing I was curious about is sort of where you are in your thinking about what's a next step you would like to take within your planning process for advanced tier, something that you've had on your mind that you want to learn more about, or something that you want to do to move your process forward. So I think you're able to pick more than one item. And we'll give you a minute to go ahead and fill that out. How are we doing, Christy?
We're looking pretty good. We'll give folks another few seconds and then we'll share the results.
Fantastic. So in closing, again, I'd like to thank you for joining me today. I am so excited to hear Franklin Elementary School's presentation and to learn from them. Some of the most important lessons that I've learned have really been working with school partners. And so I am so excited to hear from them. And I see some of our next steps: assess what you currently have in place. So some of those implementation fidelity tools I mentioned can be really a helpful starting point to figure out what you have, what you need, and where to go. learning more about requirements, reviewing current screening process, reviewing existing interventions. So a lot of sort of self-assessment items. So thank you all for sharing that. That's helpful for me to know. It gives me some things to think about.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lorman. It's such a pleasure to have you joining us. We're going to switch gears right now to the Franklin team. So I'm going to turn it over to Ms. Amy Panich, who is the principal, and Ms. Teresa Finkelstein, who is the vice principal. Thank you so much for being with us.
Good afternoon, everyone. We can go to the next slide. I'm Amy Panich, principal of Franklin School, which is located in the North Ward of Newark. Our school has been undergoing an expansion, which will be completed next year as we become a pre-K through 8th grade school. We currently have about 700 students, and we will be close to 800 next year with about 60 to 70 certified teachers. About 40% of our students require bilingual services, and 25% have an IEP, which makes us one of the largest bilingual and students with exceptional needs programs in the district. Today, I'm joined by one of my vice principals, Teresa Finkelstein, and together we will share our journey to develop sustainable PBSIS practices at Franklin to support all students. You can go to the next slide. So there's a little overview of what we have in place at Franklin School. So every week we have a student support team that meets, that's comprised of key stakeholders throughout our school and community. We have tier 1, 2, and 3 services in place for students, and we are still expanding them. And we have been working to implement a universal SEL program throughout our school. We can go to the next slide. So about 5 years ago, while partnering with the New Jersey Coalition for Inclusive Education, we recognized that our greatest obstacle towards becoming more inclusive was not the academic supports we had in place, but it was the socio-emotional needs of the students. We realized that if we didn't provide our students with the socio-emotional supports necessary, they would never reach their true academic potential. It was at that time that Franklin School placed an emphasis on developing school-wide sustainable SEL PBSIS practices. These practices are at the core of the belief system shared by our admin team. As such, we had to prioritize it and research how we could find funding to support our students, staff, and families' SEL needs. With that in mind, we decided to research grant opportunities to help fill this need in our school and wrote a one-year grant with the Newark Trust around inclusive practices, where we focused on 2 grades and building out our tier 1 program to reduce office referrals and target where those behaviors were occurring. When that year concluded, we saw so much success and progress that we applied for the grant again, focusing on 2 additional grades as we were expanding to middle school. When those 2 years concluded, we knew we wanted to grow our practices school-wide, so we put a team together and wrote a 3-year grant to begin growing our tier 1 school-wide and branch off to develop tier 2 and tier 3 supports. It was at this time that the pandemic began and the need for these supports became even more instrumental. During the first 3 years of implementation, we spent time developing a sustainable tier 1 program where the entire school developed and reinforced core values, as well as developed classroom systems that were reinforced school-wide. This included rebranding our school to give it an identity that supported our middle school expansion. It has taken the course of a couple of years, but our entire community has embraced our core values and is proud to wear our Franklin gear to show they are a Franklin Falcon. Next slide. Each year, we have a Falcon Bucks kickoff where we review what it is like to be safe, kind, and respectful in all avenues of our school, and we train our entire staff on our Falcon Bucks system. We have also been fortunate enough to grow 3 teacher leaders who have completed SEL certification through Rutgers. These lead teachers meet weekly to develop school-wide events, monthly grade level meetings, monthly SEL leadership team meetings, and monthly staff SEL events. We also have branched out to include student voice by electing a PBIS student council. As you can see, a lot of time and effort has been put into growing and developing a sustainable Tier 1 system, but we felt it was necessary to do this first before branching off to develop Tier 2 practices. We knew we needed the foundation. Our strong Tier 1 system addresses the needs of about 85% of our students and allows us to focus our Tier 2 and 3 interventions for a smaller group. Next slide.
Through the years, we've developed a number of Tier 2 groups run by teacher leaders and our social workers. We currently have a one step at a time group for our middle school boys, which focuses on male mentoring. We have a girl code group, which focuses on the principles of becoming a young lady and how to deal with anxiety. We also, through the pandemic, have developed a grief counseling group. And in our K-2 grades, we have a friends group that focuses on social skills. To support our families of Tier 2 students, we have carefully enlisted parents to engage in our ParentSEL Academy. We use this group to help train our parents on how to deal with difficult situations that may be occurring in the home while giving parents a voice to help grow and shape our programs. It is with their input that we are able to best support our students and their families. Next slide. To fully gauge who we support within our Tier 2 services, we complete a school-wide screener called the SABRS. SABRS stands for the Social, Academic, and Emotional Behavior Risk Screener. The SABRS is a brief research-based universal screener used to assess student behavioral and emotional risk. This tool can be completed by teachers or by students self-reporting, and it is intended for students in grades K through 12. We have our teachers complete a screener for each student in K-3, and students self-report in grades 4 through 7. Those results are then analyzed, and students fall into 4 categories: follow-up, high risk, at risk, and not at risk. Then our Intervention and Referral Services Committee reviews the data and conducts one-on-one meetings with teachers to see who would best benefit from our Tier 2 services. This is a lengthy process, but we do feel that it is necessary to have those conversations with teachers to truly understand the data and best support our students. Next slide. We are in the beginning stages of exploring Tier 3 for our students, but with that said, we have placed a huge emphasis on connecting with our students that are most at risk. Through our Student Support Committee, we discuss our most at-risk students at our bi-weekly meetings to tap into resources for both students, staff, and families. This year, through those conversations, we found out that one of our students that is most in need of support had a hidden talent for art. We connected with our art teacher. She took that talent and submitted him for an art award through Scholastic. This allowed us to provide him with an opportunity that we never were able to tap into previously. As such, our teacher has even been able to provide him with weekly art therapy to support not only his social emotional needs, but to support the academic needs as well. We are currently channeling this newfound passion for him and having him meet with our social workers to learn all about one of our comprehensive schools so that he now sees the larger picture. In his meetings with the social workers, they talk about the application process as well as future goals. Our social workers also pull many of our other most at-risk students weekly to get that one-on-one connection. They then bring back what they've learned in their meetings to our larger student support committee so that we continue putting our heads together as a team to find different ways and avenues to support our Tier 3 students. For Tier 3, we also create behavior intervention plans, provide multiple testing accommodations. We have a check-in and check-out system with various adults throughout the building. And as you can see, we'll talk about it as we move forward. We are continuing to grow this piece. Next slide.
Developing systems for all of our school-wide staff to form and support Tier 2 systems has proven to be successful And we attribute this to staff who believed in these systems and invested the time to develop relationships with our students and support them through check-in and check-out systems daily, conduct small groups with them, and organize school events to get to know their families. As a result of these groups, our teachers reported less time off task within their classrooms and less time dealing with discipline issues. The overall mindset of our staff has transitioned over the past 5 years to become more preventative and rewarding of positive behaviors, which has lessened referrals and supported students to self-regulate, which will support them throughout their lives. Next slide.
Some of our continued challenges are that we are always seeking ways to improve our parent engagement and community partners. As we mentioned, we are in year 5 implementation, and while we have begun these pieces, we are in the process of growing and expanding our Parent Academy of our most at-risk students to not only support our families, but to let them know that we truly value our partnership with them. As a growing school, we continually seek partners within the community to grow and develop this partnership, and that is where we are at today. Next slide. We have learned many lessons throughout this process. We learned that many students want to be a part of our Tier 2 groups, whether or not the data qualifies them to be supported. We have adapted and developed school-wide success hour to have groups throughout our middle school be part of small group setting to work on areas encompassing their SEL needs as well as their academics. Developing teacher leaders helped with buy-in as well as develop sustainable coaching model for our school. And last, but most importantly, we have made SEL practices a priority at our school by hosting a monthly SEL grade level meeting for all staff, monthly SEL leadership team meetings, and discussing all of our Tier 2 group meetings at our bi-monthly student support team meeting. We find that having all these meetings helps triangulate and support our staff and supporting everybody within our SEL needs. Next slide.
We'd like to thank you all for inviting us to share our journey with you. If you would like to continue to learn more, we invite you to follow us on social media at Franklin NPS.
Thank you so much to the Franklin team. Thank you so much, Ms. Finkelstein, Ms. Panich, for sharing all of the wonderful work that you're doing. These are just some additional resources and links that we provided. We always make the slides available to everyone. And now we're going to switch gears and actually move into our Q&A portion of our presentation. Stuart, I'll turn it over to you.
Yes, and it looks like we do have a few questions. And if you do have any questions, please feel free to drop those into the Q&A using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. So the first question is for Dr. Lorman, considering the eligibility for the opportunity that you had mentioned to train some districts. They specifically mentioned that we have PBIS in our high school for the last 3 years, and our middle school is beginning to implement this year. Would we be eligible for that training?
Hi, thank you so much for the question. And your high school has been a phenomenal partner. We're also working with an elementary school. So all schools in the state are eligible. There is an enrollment process. And if you visit our website, www.njpbs.org, there's an enrollment tab. And in that tab, there's a link that you can submit the principal's name and the name of the school. So there's no cost to schools or districts to enroll in an upcoming training cohort. It is a competitive application process. And typically that occurs around the May-June time of the year. So now is a great time if you have any interest in submitting the name of your school. Again, you can just go to the enrollment tab and there's a link in there that you can click on. It'll bring you to a Qualtrics page. It's just the principal's name, their email, and the name of the school. You can also email me directly and we can make that email available. And I look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you so much. We also have a question for Ms. Panish and Finkelstein. So you had mentioned that you wanted to fully develop a sustainable Tier 1 system of support for your school before then branching out to Tier 2 services. What considerations did you take into account when deciding that you were ready for Tier 2 services?
So when we realized that the majority of our students' needs were being addressed by everything that we had in place, but there were still, I would say we're simultaneously, we didn't wait until Tier 1 was fully established in order to address the needs of additional students. But it was once we had that we had our data showed that most of our students' needs were being addressed by our Tier 1 system, we were able to then further develop our Tier 2 and 3 systems. Tier 3, we are still working to develop. Again, because we individualize them to the needs of each student.
Thank you. And it looks like we have another question for you. So I'm curious about the ParentSEL Academy. What are the training topics, and do those relate to the school-wide SEL? And also, how often do you provide parent training?
So as we mentioned, this is something very new this year. We just had our 3rd meeting. So the meetings occur monthly. The topics are really driven by the parents. So we sent out a survey. Our initial meeting was about mindfulness and letting them know all of our Tier 1 supports within the school. And through the survey, believe it or not, they have asked for some more supports and how to support students through academics at home. So we've taken that avenue. And then next month, they have requested to do some trainings on relationship building. So we try to tie it back to the core competencies within SEL, but also keeping at heart the current parental need via the surveys and conversations.
Wonderful, thank you. And it looks like we still have some more questions coming in, so that's great. Feel free to continue putting your questions in the chat or in the Q&A. So this one looks like it could be a question for either Ms. Lorman or Dr. Lorman or the Franklin team. Just kind of looking for some feedback about timelines and kind of how long does it typically take to build out an entire MTSS system?
I'm happy to jump in. I'm sure that Ms. Panich has some input as well, how long it took her and her team. Our folks go through a 3-year training process, and each year we focus on a different component. It is a little bit fluid because schools are needing to reflect on where they are in the process. So everybody starts at a little different place, which can impact. So the research tells us it takes 3 to 5 years to really install your system to a point where you're ready to sustain it over time. And moving systematically at a steady pace, you don't want to rush into it. There are a lot of decisions. You want to build that really strong foundation. So I would say working within a 3-year time frame to really plan all of the different intervention tiers, but it does depend too on where you're starting and what you already have in place.
I agree. So once we recognized the need at Franklin, it took a few years as we started small with a couple of grade levels and then expanded. After, I would say year 3 was when we were able to wanted to focus on sustainability without needing the support and funding from the Newark Trust. So we created our own SEL leadership team comprised of teachers, made sure that those teachers had training, and now they lead the work, and that SEL leadership team has expanded. So now this is our 5th year, and it was our final year with the grant because we are now at a place where we can sustain these supports on our own.
Thank you to you both. And we have a question about the staffing at Franklin. Just a question about how many school social workers do you have for the 700 to 800 students at Franklin?
We have 2 social workers, plus a child study team, which is comprised of 2 people as well.
And another question, kind of considering staffing for Dr. Lorman, We have a lot of students in need of right now of tier 2 and tier 3 services, but don't have the staff capacity to meet the high demand. We're trying to think of strategies to provide wider and more equitable access to group and individual services, but we're finding that students are requiring more intensive and longer interventions. Do you have any suggestions?
Yeah, so that's that question comes up a lot with our school partners as well, and there isn't an easy answer. But what I would say first is really be thoughtful about which interventions you're selecting and their capacity to address a wider array of student needs. There are interventions like a check-in system, for example, that can be a good starting point for a lot of students. In working with Halstead Middle School was one of the examples I was sharing. This is a question that comes up for them a lot in figuring out how they're going to sustain their interventions. So they also work with community partners who can provide specialized counseling and therapeutic interventions. And they also, they really think about where their universal needs are too. And so when they start to see that they're having a lot of students identified for secondary, and that number has really grown exponentially in this past year, they focus on the universal as well. And they say, well, if we have this large number of students who are demonstrating a need, what can we do at the universal level to try to address that for all of our students? So it's being really kind of dynamic with the interventions too, and always reflecting back on where you're at with your universal tier. I think using the tools that Halstead and Burlington Township have used with the matrices to sort of plot out what they have available and where their gaps are also helps you to just be more intentional in figuring out what additional interventions that you might need. But scale and sustainability are really important questions. You don't want to put something in place that you're not going to be able to maintain over time.
Yeah, and for the Franklin team, a question that perhaps kind of branches from that. It's great that you have teacher engagement in your tier 2 groups. How did you recruit teachers to lead the groups, and were there any types of special trainings that were required?
So we definitely gauge the interest of our teachers. One teacher that runs our male mentoring group, he expressed interest in it. So we tapped into that interest. He was actually trained alongside our NJCIE consultants when we had them working with us. So he did receive lots of training through them. And then our Girl Code group actually started by our NJC consultant. And then we branched it off to a teacher leader, which she had trained. So we had tapped into the resources that we had secured via the grant. But I will say that over the past few years, now that we're on year 5, our SEL leadership team is now bigger than ever, and more interest in terms of teachers leading those groups is evolving. So definitely through the SEL leadership team, we were able to grow and develop those leaders.
Thank you. One more question for the Franklin team is about your student support committee that you mentioned. So this isn't something that my school currently has in place. Could you share more details on the makeup of the student support committee, including kind of who sits on that committee and what one of those meetings might look like in practice?
Sure. So the committee is comprised of our admin team, which is myself and and 2 vice principals, our school nurse, our 2 social workers, our academic coaches, which we have 2 of, our 2 academic interventionists, our attendance counselor, and a member of the child study team, as well as our parent liaison. So we have an agenda that we use for every one of our meetings. There are different committees within the larger group, and through those committees, everyone meets and basically presents out to the whole group at these bi-monthly meetings. And we really, we do discuss individual student needs, and how we as a collective group can support those students and make sure that they are successful. And we address both the academic and socio-emotional needs of the students.
Wonderful. And it looks like we have one last question in the queue, but maybe time for one more. If there's any attendees that have a question that's on their mind, feel free to drop that into the chat. But the question we have in front of us is, I'd like to be as efficient as possible when assembling or assigning an existing team to the task of identifying, referring, and evaluating students for Tier 2 and 3 services. We have our child study and INRS teams that are currently charged with these responsibilities. Would you suggest creating a separate team that's focused on MTSS implementation? And if so, who would you suggest be involved and how often should they meet? That's a little bit of a mouthful, so if we need to follow up with any of these questions, happy to do that. And that might be a question for Dr. Lorman.
So when we work with our school partners, we really encourage them to build off of what exists, what their current implementation strengths are. So if you have existing teams and personnel that are already working together effectively, that they have that multidisciplinary representation, that your team is really reflective of your stakeholders and stakeholder voice, I would suggest self-assessing what it is that you're currently doing and against what it is you'd like to be doing, because it could be challenging logistic-wise to add another team that you have to coordinate. And so we find that most of our schools tend to build off of an existing INRS team, but it does mean that they shift their INRS practices a little bit. They go through a bit of a transformative process to arrive at ultimately what they want their system and their teaming process to look like.
And it looks like those are all of the questions that we have for you all today. Thank you so much for all of the wonderful and thoughtful responses, and of course for presenting for us today.
Thank you, Kati. I'll turn it over to you now. So then that way we can make sure that folks get access to the survey.
Sure. Well, thank you everyone for being with us today and for sharing and your questions for our presenters during our webinar today. Also a big thank you to our presenters. And as Christy said, I'm now sharing on the screen our evaluation survey QR code. So if you take your mobile device and you can hover over, you'll be able to access our short evaluation survey. Just as a reminder, our center is funded through SAMSA, and as part of receiving this funding, we are required to submit data related to the quality of this event. So you can either click the link that I provided in the chat box, or you can also hover over the QR code and access our short evaluation survey there. Again, I want to thank everyone for joining us today. Again, big thank you to our presenters, and we hope that you have a wonderful rest of your day, and we hope to see you at our next webinar for our session 5. And we will send out a link to our presentation slides, a link to your certificate of completion, and to the recording within 1 week of today. Thank you, everyone, and be well.